With the help of Hashem, we are learning Shabbos Daf Lamed Ches. We left off on Daf Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, the last line from the Amid. We are learning the sugya both of Shehiyah, and today we're going to go into Chazara. So firstly, the big question is, what happens on Shabbos if food was cooked? Now, as we are learning, there's cooking that's violating Bishul Midoiraisa. There is the topic of our Pedic, which is people that are doing Bishul Midarabanan. There is a concept of cooking food, God forbid, B'mezid. There's a cooking food, B'shoigeg, and they could be different. And we're going to put it all together concerning if Shehiyah was done B'shoigeg, and if a person did Shehiyah B'mezid. Now, Chavra, we know we have a machlokes between Hananya and the Chachamim. According to Hananya, once the food reached Kameichel ben Rusoi, there's nothing wrong leaving that food on the stovetop, even though there's no blech on it, even though it's not Garof and Kotem. So the question will be, according to Hananya, what happens if someone forgot food that wasn't even Kameichel ben Rusoi or Avar b'mezid? Similarly, the same question will be l'chachamim. According to the chachamim, as we have been learning, if the food only reached the level of Michael ben Rusoi, you certainly may not leave it on the stovetop prior to Shabbos without doing Garof and Katum. But we also learn details, okay? Now, once it's mavushal called tzarchai, mitztamek, veraloi, for sure, you don't need to put on a blech, even l'chachamim, mitztamek, V'yafaloi, that's what we learned yesterday. There's a difference of opinions. Bishitas chachamim. So whether it's Hananya or chachamim, the topic that we'll learn about on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph will be whenever a blech is needed, what happens if shachach and you left it on the fire without a blech? And furthermore, what happens if you put it there on purpose? Now, Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph in the bottom, going into Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, we'll be speaking about Chazara. Now, there are ultimately, as we have in Shulchan Aruch Reish and Gimel, these are such important halachas to learn. There's a total in Shulchan Aruch of 5 preconditions that are needed for one to be allowed to remove food and to put it back on the blech on Shabbos. Actually, 2 of them are spoken about in our sugya. The other 3 are mashma, in between the lines, taken as a given. And the 5 details that we are mentioning, some of them are ma'akev and some of them are not, and some of them are subject to big arguments. But we're going to learn on Daf Lamed Ches is the concept of oidon biyodoi, that when you remove something from a blech on Shabbos, for you to be allowed to put it back, it has to be in your hand. We're going to learn about the other klal, that when you remove it, datoi lahachzer, not only does it have to be in your hand, but you also have to have intent to put it back on the blech. And what I just said right now is only true according to one of the 2 girsois that we have in the Gemara. We're going to learn a more lenient approach in our Gemara, either oiden biyadai or datei lahachzer. We paskin l'chumra. The other 3 dinim that are brought down in Shulchan Aruch, which is basically a given, is that even if the first 2 were met, you had in mind to put it back on. You kept the handle in your hand. But the food itself has to be mavushal called sarkai. Even though we keep on mentioning that the Ramah, Paskins like Hananya, as far as Shehiyah is concerned, once the food reached the level of Kameichel ben Rusoi, it's called cooked enough, and you don't need to leave it on a blech, but for you to put it back, the food has to be cooked, called sarkai. Number 2, that the fire has to be covered. Gruf and ketuma is needed, it's a given. And then the 5th one, the most controversial one, is that does the food have to be roisachas, burning hot for you to put it back? Does it at least have to be a little bit warm? And that's where you have a variance of opinions that already goes into other topics of bishul, achar bishul, by lach, by yavesh. But these basically just touched upon the 5 general preconditions, assuming the 5th one is it has to be warm, or some people say it has to be hot, in order for you to be allowed to do chazara. And then we're going to have on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis another Mishnah. The first, there's going to be one in the bottom of the Amud that will be tomorrow's Daf, but the Mishnah will be that everything we learned until now, sai when it comes to Shehiyah, sai when it comes to chazara, is when we have a kira. And as we spoke out in the intro, then the kira was a certain type of stove / oven where the top and the bottom were of the same width. It doesn't retain as much heat as the tanur. A tanur is a rounded type of oven where the top is much narrower than the bottom, and the entrance place to go in and out, if you want to put things in, is from the top. And all of that created a tanur that retained a lot of heat. We have been learning everything until now only when it comes to akira. And we mentioned that almost all the poskim, except that our ovens, and certainly stovetop, have a din of akira, because there's a lot of ventilation going around. It doesn't retain as much heat as the tanur. Then there's something called a kupach, that's chaf vav or kaf vav peches. It's square, but it's much smaller. There's only room on top for one pot, and because of that, it retains more heat than the kira. And as we will see, the more the heat, whether let's go with either mechze kemavashal more. Another inyan is that even though, for example, we learned in the beginning of Pedikira that if the fuel that you use was straw or stubble, since it gets burnt out so quick and it doesn't leave any coals, there's much less chashash, or there's no chashash of shema yechata. Why would you stoke it? We're going to see that's not true, that in the tanur, even kash and gevava, because of its heat, could have a spark or two, and people might be yechata there. So the hotter, the more chomer we have to get. So ultimately, there's going to be three levels. Everything that we learned until now was kira. A little bit hotter, a little bit more chomer is going to be the kupach, and then the most chomer is going to be the tanur. And without any further ado, chavra freilach, let's go to the bottom of the Lamed Zayin Amid Beis. Says the Gemara, Bo'u minei Rab Chia bar Abba. They asked from Rab Chia bar Abba, Daf Lamed Ches. Shochach kedei al gabe kira. If a person left by accident, they forgot a pot on top of a kira. Now again, who are we talking about? So Rashi writes in the top of Rashi, okay, let's go L'shitas Chachamim. L'shitas Chachamim, even though the food is Kamaichel ben Derusoi, you may not leave it on the fire, midrabanan. If you did not, let's use the word blech, if you didn't put a blech on the fire. And here, if someone forgot and they left under the fire without a blech, that's Rashi. Tosfos adds, he's not contradicting Rashi. Tosfos says, our Gemara can follow Chananya. See, Tosfos always is going to insist, like the Ramah quotes the Tosfos, right? Aflagav the Kaimelon ke Chananya, look inside the top Tosfos, and a Chanami say there. In other words, once the food is Kamaichel ben Derusoi, you don't need a blech. Okay, the Gemara's question is going to be, what's going to happen if the food did not reach Kamaichel ben Derusoi? And then, even according to Hanania, if it's not Garof and Katum, midrabanan, you can't leave, and you left it. So if you forgot, and let's get back inside the Gemara, and do Bishla b'Shabbos, this nuance is important, as we'll see later. Sometimes you can forget, and then right away remove it. No, you forgot, and it cooked. Mahu, what's the din right now? Oh, so the Gemara says, well, they asked that question from Rab Chia bar Abba, Ishtek v'lei amar lei v'lei midi. That's a good klal in life. And by the way, this is complex. And the Gemara, with tremendous chachma here, which makes it a lot easier for us, the Gemara doesn't always do it for us, is going to only open up the Rashi Perakim, as we'll see in a moment. We're going to try to keep things simple because they get complex. There's like categories and there's subcategories. The Gemara only goes into the categories, which is Hamachaya. As far as learning it good, you can chazer the categories, and then at another time, we're going to go into the greater detail. So first, he didn't answer. Number two, Lomachar, that's a Yid. What do you think about when you go to sleep? This is Gan Eden, what we're living in. This is what should be on our head. So the next morning, Nafak v'darishlu, he gave the answer. And he quoted first a Mishnah that we have in Terumais. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shar kol nidvarei. Like we read by the Tanoim, Eloheinu Rashi Perakim. Guys, we're learning only the general concepts. Hamavashel b'Shabbos. If a person cooks on Shabbos, now Chevra here, the Mishnah is speaking about Bishul Doiraisa. We're not speaking about Bishul Derabanan. So first of all, those to wissen sein that there's an afkamina whether this was done b'shoigeg or b'mezid. That's the Rashi Perakim. B'shoigeg yoichal, b'mezid lo yoichal. Now, Chevra, we are familiar with other Mishnais and that are a lot more complicated. Let me just there's a machlokes tanoim in this statement. Look, when it says b'shoigeg yoichal, does it mean on Shabbos, or at least do you have to wait? After Shabbos. When it says b'mezid lo yoichel, does it mean on Shabbos? Does it mean you may not eat it forever? Another nuance, all subcategories. If it was cooked for me, then there's going to be greater stringencies for me, less stringencies for others. to approach this topic, we don't have to go into all that. So he quoted the Mishnah Machayim Trumas just to get the general Rashi Parakim. Notice we find the din that there's a difference between Shogeg and Mezid. However, says Rab Chia bar Abba, here that we are discussing Shehiyah, which is Bishul Midrabanan, here Veloishna, here we will not make any distinction Benegeya, Shogeg, or Mezid. Now what does that mean? When someone gives you that answer, we're not going to make a distinction, meaning we're going to be Machmir in both cases, or we're not going to make a distinction and we're going to be making, he didn't say right away. So now the Gemara wants to unpackage this. So frag the Gemara, what does Rab Chia bar Abba mean? My Veloishna, Machloikas groups. Rabba and Rabbi Yosef, the Omri Tarvayu, what Rab Chia bar Abba meant to say is Leheteiram. And why will we be more lenient here? Zukt, they explain, because Mivashel, Mishnah and Trumais, right, when we're speaking about, cooking, who the Ka'avid Maiseh, you did something on Shabbos, you put it on the fire, that's why the din is B'mezid lo yoichal, however you apply the yoichal, right? We're more machmer than shoygik. Aval but over here, aval hai, the loy Ka'avid Maiseh. Guys, what was this person's Aveda? You can't tell a person you can't put something on the fire before Shabbos. You're not doing bishul as far as Isser Veheter. The violation was he should have removed it. That's the way you should word it. He should have removed it. So he didn't remove it. So it was a sin of inaction. So therefore it makes sense that even b'mezid nabi yoichal. That's Rabba and Rabbi Yosef b'shitas Rabbi Chia bar Abba. However, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar mamash punkt verkehrt, that when he said loishna is even b'shoigeg lo yoichal. Now again, guys, the Gemara here is not going into the details of what does lo yoichal mean. It can mean many things. Like I said, it can mean never. It can mean not on Shabbos, or you have to wait v'chtei asu. Yes, we'll differentiate for peoples. All of that. Just the first mamash darashi perakim. And why? 1 second. It's bishul derabanan. Where would you find that by a derabanan you'll be more chamer than doraisa? My friends, many times. Like people don't want to be violate Shabbos. People sometimes don't take rabbanans that seriously, especially when they can get away by saying what they did. B'mezid was really done b'shoigeg, as he explains. Mivashel, when it comes to bishul doiraisa, hu deloika asi li'i arume. No one is going to go ahead and be mechalal Shabbos, knowing the din in the Mishnah and Trumos. That what? That b'mezid lo yoichel, b'shoigeg yoichel. You're not going to have a person that's going to cook it b'mezid, and then say, well, I did it b'shoigeg and I should be allowed to eat it. No one is going to be cooking on Shabbos. So there's no need to make exera. So therefore, b'shoigeg yoichel. But over here, since the issue was a drabanan, it's possible that it's theoretically, we should also differentiate. Only b'mezid shehiyah. You put it, lo yoichel. You forgot. Really, it should be you can eat it. But if that would be the case, then people are going to end up leaving it b'mezid, claim that it was b'shoigeg. So to prevent that, the Chacham made a gzeira.
Especially if it's almost Shabbos and you put it.
And you don't have time to do Garif and Katum. Very good. Aval since it's possible to Asili Arume, he's gonna fake. He's gonna be a Ramoi, a Faper, that's in Yiddish. So b'shoigeg nami lo yoichal. Okay, so you have either l'chumra or l'kolam. Says the Gemara Meisvei, this will be a question on Rabba and Rabbi Yosef. It says in a Braisa. Right, the answer was from Rabbi Chia bar Abba Namoira. State in a Braisa shochach kedei al gabe kira. Clear, that's the case. You forgot, someone forgot a pot. Again, guys, don't confuse Chananya and Chachamim. It doesn't matter. Each one l'shitosai, in whichever case you needed to have a blech. Here was you didn't have the blech and you shachach. That means a shoigeg and the bishlo b'Shabbos. So the Braisa uses the same format, the same Rashi Parakim as the Mishnah we just quoted from Tanumais. B'shoigig yoichal, b'mezid lo yoichal. Now you got yourself a problem, and you got yourself a simple answer. And like we just mentioned, if you say lo chumra, everything works. In other words, according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, really this is like bishul doiraisa. But since the Chachamim at a certain point were afraid that people are going to do it b'mezid, and they're going to claim they did it b'shoigeg, so they made this gezeira. These Gezedas Midrabanan could have happened after the times of the Tanoim, and it only happened in the Bisman Amoyroim. It's not a problem. You get it? According to Rabban Abi Yosef, clearly he's writing B'shoigig, Yoichel B'mezid, Lo Yoichel. What does Rabban Abi Yosef hold? They're matir. And Amoyra cannot be more matir than a Tana. Then he says, "Bemet varam amurim bechamen sholichum kol tzarchan v'tafshel shalibishol kol tzarchay avol chamen sholichum kol tzarchay v'tafshel shalibishol kol tzarchay." If it was completely, the water was hot, completely hot. If the food was completely cooked, then bein b'shoigig, bein b'mezid, yoichal divrei Rav Meir. Okay. In other words, Rav Meir holds that the Isur Achila that we have in the beginning of this Braisa is only if the food was actually cooked, right, against halacha on Shabbos. Here, if the food was completely cooked before Shabbos, Rav Meir says you can eat it regardless. Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, chamen shehuchmu kol tzarkon, if the water was completely heated up. Now, let's go back to what we learned yesterday. What happens if water that's completely heated up remains more on the fire? Only a downside. I know the word mitztamik means to shrivel. Water doesn't shrivel, but water evaporates. It's the same nekuda. And there's no upside. By foods, many times it gets tastier. The water doesn't get better. So by chamin, shuchma kol tzarkon, then indeed Rabbi Yehuda's moida post facto. That mutarim mepnei shemitztamik veraloi. Tafshel shebishol kol tzarkoi. Asur. Right, he disagrees with Rav Meir, mepnei shemitztamik v'yafaloi. And a few examples. V'chol hamitztamik v'yafaloi, even if food is completely cooked from before Shabbos, but you left it on the blech. Guys, we're leaving it on, not on the blech, on the fire without a blech. That's the issue. And as it stays on the fire, even though mitzad echad, it's losing its moisture, but it's becoming tastier. Here we have vital examples. We missed Yud Samach yesterday with all of the cooking examples. Kruv, cabbage, pulin, beans. Look at the Gemara now. Basar taruf. Basar taruf is great. Basar taruf means minced meat. What was the last thing we learned yesterday? That was the greatest thing. That when it comes to people who want to serve food to guests, it's always halachically mitztamik veraloi. Because even when food gets tastier as it remains on the fire, you would rather, when it comes to yourself, that's what it's mashma, quality over quantity. I'll have a smaller piece of flesh, but it's going to be tastier. When you have guests, many people want to show how generous they are. They would rather serve the guest a bigger piece of meat, even though it's not even tastier. So as time goes on, it's always raloi to the balabas. So that's why it says basar taruf, because we're giving examples of mitztamik v'yafaloi. If it would be pieces of meat, again, it's a given that people have guests on Shabbos. Or doesn't have a guest on Shabbos. If you have a real, not minced, but a shtickle meat, then it's automatically mitztamik v'raloi. That's why these are examples where then it also.
How? Don't serve me kruv and beans, please.
Aha, here we go. We need you. Now, v'chol mitztamik v'raloi muter. Now, guys, I know you're going to jump for a second because we learned yesterday Mamash on Lamed Zayin Amad Aleph, Rab Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and we got to resolve that. I know it doesn't fit with what we learned yesterday. We're going to address that in a moment. But first, coming back over here, Ktani Miyav state that if you have a tafshel, Shaloi Bishel Kol Tzarkoi, the Braisa says, hello, you can only eat it if you left it there b'shoigig and not b'mezid. Well, Rab Chia did not make a distinction. So Bish, according to Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, that understands Rab Chia's psak lechumra. You can always go lechumra. It makes sense. Kan, meaning the Braisas, koidim gezeira. And before the gezeira, they didn't change. The Rabbanan mirrored the din doiraisa, the Mishnah that we quoted from Terumais. B'mezid lo yoichel, b'shoigig yoichel. Guys, I just want everyone to appreciate how kind the Gemara is that we're only speaking about the Rashi Parakim, because the details get complicated. This is simple. And here means Rab Chia Barabba, at the times of the Amoraim, they were afraid that Dilma Asili Arume, someone is going to leave it on the fire, b'mezid, and claim it was b'shoigig, so they made a gzeira. We're always machman. According to Rabbi Yosef, the Amri that Rab Chia Barabba was leheteira, memanavshach, I koidim gzeira. If the Braisa, then kashya mezid. Or if there was me'ikar adin, it's always mutter. Then why is the Braisa being machmer? And if the Braisa is la'achar agzeira, is ukashina mishoigik. And therefore the Gemara says, guys, indeed, Kasha. Now I know that normally kasha is not tiyufta. Every time tiyufta means completely checkmate. Kasha means that there's a way to faren for it. The Gemara doesn't say here how you can answer it, but Chevra, what we are basically doing in our Gemara is that we are accepting that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's understanding Bishitas Reb Chia bar Abba is the correct one. What's he, Loishna means that by Shehiyah, look at the irony, if you needed to put a blech on, Bein lechananya, bein lerabanan, whichever place the food was at, and you didn't, even though shachach, the food cannot be eaten. What does that mean? We'll leave it for another time. Just to know that normally not be eaten normally means not to be eaten on that Shabbos, and even after Shabbos, b'chdei sheyasu. But not that lo yochel oilamis. Okay. Now, my gezeirta, what led to the gezeirta that we spoke this out already by heart? To Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Shmuel, Amar Reb Abba, Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav. Bat chilam initially hoyo oimrim hamavashal b'Shabbos b'shoigeg yoichal, which is true. B'meizid lo yoichal, and not only was that the din by bishul de'oraisa. Oh, sorry, when you did v'hu adin l'sheicheach, meaning if you forgot cooked, that's halachically not cooked food that's not cooked on the blech on the stove without a blech on blech before Shabbos. However, it's mamash clear. However, Misharabu Mashin b'Mezid came along people and they said, listen, it's not even Shabbos, and I'm going to leave it. And they would claim later that Shechechem Anu. Why would they say that? Because b'Shoigeg, they know everyone allows you to eat it. So Chazru v'Kansu al HaShecheyach. Okay, very good. Now, before we go on, we learned yesterday Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Meir Bechlal didn't fit with the Mishnah. Even with Rabbi Yehuda, we made a nuanced difference between our Mishnah and the Braisa. So Chavre, it's going to be very easy to follow the Gemara. If you find Rashi, my Rebbe taught me you have 2 hands, 2 fingers. 1 finger for the Gemara, 1 finger for Rashi. That's why God gave you 2 hands. So Kasha that Rav Meir, Rav Meir, Zogt Rashi. Kasha that Rav Meir, it's the middle of Amid. The Tnan Liel Bereish Pirkin. Bereish Pirkin means Daf Lamed Zayin, because the Perek we get on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis. That Lirav Meir Aliba de Beisilol. Remember that? But let's just focus where the contradiction is. We learned yesterday that what? That Chamin Ava Loi Tafshel. In other words, cooked food may not be left if it's not blecht, if it's not Garuf and Cotton. V'hacha over here. Shari, Chamin, if the tafshel was already bishul called sarkoi, then you can leave it. Keep your finger inside Rashi. Back in the Gemara. And Kasha de Rabbi Yehuda, Ad Rabbi Yehuda, Rashi, Kasha de Rabbi Yehuda, Der Hasam, Andaf Lamed Zayin, Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Chamin v'tafshel, that what? The Hasam, Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Chamin v'tafshel, is allowed. V'hacha asar tafshel shel bishul called sarkoi. If the taste improves. And above we learned according to Rabbi Yehuda that no, if it's completely mevushal kol tzarkoi, then you are allowed to leave it on a unblecht stovetop. Answers the Gemara, Dir Rav Meir ad Rav Meir loy kasha, Daf Lamed Zayin, right? That loy tafshil was lechatchila. Here we're speaking about the Eved. Very good. Rav Meir is very machmer. The Rabbi Yehuda drew the Namalei Kasha, Daf Lamed Zayin, that allows, who told you Daf Lamed Zayin is speaking about an unblecht oven? No. When does Rabbi Yehuda allow it? If Begerufa Viktuma, and Kan B'She'ena Gerufa Viktuma. Coming back, Chaveh, this is important. So the first din was that if Shachach, no, it's if you needed to have a blech, whichever shita you're going to go by, and you forgot it on the fire without a blech, we're learning in the Gemara that because of Gzeira, you can't eat that food. Lo yochel. Now comes the next question. What happens, not if you forgot, if you purposefully let it on the fire. Now let me ask anyone who's learning this, how do you understand this Gemara? If we just concluded, we refuted the Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef, even only Shachach, because of Gzeira, b'meizid lo yochel, even b'shroigeg, b'meizid lo yochel. What is the question? It doesn't fit. So the Ritva and other Rishonim explain like this: that Atkan and Shoye got to Mezid is that you had food that was halachically not yet cooked. It needed a blech. You left it shachach without a blech, and then it actually got better on Shabbos. That is where before the Gezerah, taka b'shoygig, you would be allowed to eat it. B'mezid, it must be that our Gemara is speaking about a case. Taka avar v'shom means b'mezid. You left it on the fire. You left food that could have gotten better, but you took it off the fire that's unblecht on Shabbos before it got better. It must be that's the case. In other words, the mezid was you shouldn't have left it, but it did not yet have enough time to improve, and now you removed it. That must be the kasha, that window. Because if you mamish left it and it got worse,
it was put on before?
Before Shabbos, it was left always.
Meaning before?
Left on unblecht. It was, yes, it was left, very good. It was left where you needed to put a blech.
And it cooked past that point.
And it went into Shabbos, but it didn't stay enough time for it to get better.
So it's now after Machal Ben Yisrael, or it's still before?
It's still before. Very good. It's still before. In other words, it did not yet improve, because if it would have improved or gone beyond, even only mitztamik, then for sure not. We just said b'shoygig not. What's the kasha? It's very interesting. The Gemara didn't clarify it, because many of these questions were not asked at the same time by the same people. Which they compile different discussions. There is a flow, but there's a lot of info missing. Okay, so we say mikon surabanan, for the very fact that you b'mezid left it on the fire, just because you saved it by you removing it on Shabbos, guys, from the fire prior to it improving. So what? For the fact that you left it b'mezid, you knew you're not allowed to leave it. You have to put a blech on, or like. So Tashema, the Omar Shmuel Bar Nasan Omar Rab Chanina, Kshalach Rabbi Yossi Litzipoidi, Motza Chamin, Shenishtahu al Gabi Akira, must be unblecht, right? If not, there's no issue. He found hot water that was left on Akira without a blech. V'loi asar lahen, that's by hot water. But beitzim mitzumakos, but there were shriveled eggs. Shenishtanu al Gabi Akira. Let's go Chevra lechachamim. That it's called mitztamik v'yafaloi. In other words, and therefore you would have to put a blech on. And they didn't put a blech. V'asar lahen. V'asar lahen. And again, to make this fit the kasha, in other words, the case was that it was removed right after Shabbos came in. Didn't improve. And my lav lo oisa Shabbos. It was left b'mezid. Yeah. That's exactly the case. No, it's l'chayda, you have a raya. So the Gemara says, how do you know that? You have no proof. Maybe all he said was, you can't, he was telling them, don't do this again. When someone does something and he says, asur, meaning, don't do such a thing. But maybe since they removed it from the fire before it got better, maybe he would allow them to eat them. So this story doesn't resolve. So this remains an unresolved boya. Now before we go on, back to the chef, B'chlal, you speak about eggs. What eggs improved on the fire? Like hard-boiled eggs? So yeah, the answer is yeah. And if it doesn't work that way in your kitchen, so what? It means nothing. We have to know what the Torah says. The Torah says that eggs, the longer you boil them, the better they get. Mechlal debeitzim mitzumakos. Number one, umetztamik v'yafalahem, because you have to understand something. If the egg was fully made before, then it's a non-issue. Even like chachamim, you don't need to put a blech. You know, question mark, azoi, question in azoi, exactly. The raya is to Amar Rab Chama Bar Chanina Pam Achas Nis Orachti Ani veRebbi Lamakam Echad. We were both at the same place, guys. This is not on Shabbos. This is on a weekday. And they brought to us eggs that were so shriveled they were ke'uzuradim. They were like sorb apples. In other words, the eggs shriveled up. And v'achalnu mehen harbe. So tzemach, when you put your hard-boiled eggs on the fire, see what happens. See how little they get. The longer they are in the fire, the better they get.
People put them in shalom overnight.
People, that's, I know we have a chef. Exactly. Why? Because if they would get dried out and they would be bad, you wouldn't put it in a shalom. Egg is something that taket can get a bissel shriveled, but the yafalahen, so it needs to have, according to the Chachamim, a blech prior to Shabbos. Chava Atkan, the Rashi Perakim of the Sugya of Shehiyah, and now we're moving on to the second bave, to the second clause in the Mishnah, the intro, clause 1, clause 2, Mishnah Daf Lamed Beis, that speaks about Chazara, Beisil Aloimrim, Af Machzirin. So let's go into the preconditions, like we mentioned, what exactly is needed for one to be allowed to replace food on the blech, on the fire, on Shabbos Kodesh. Amar Absheshes. Le divrei ha'omer, this is Beisil. According to the one that says, Daf Lamed Chasam Beis, that machzirin, afilu machzirin, you should know that's true even b'Shabbos. Hello, what are we talking about? What we're talking about Chazara during the week? I love these Gemaras. Like without Rashi, you don't begin to understand. So we mentioned in the intro that from the 5 preconditions that you need to be allowed to replace food on a blech, the 2 that are explicitly spoken about here in Shabbos Daf Lamed Ches is datoy lahachzer. You have to have intent when you remove it that you're going to replace it. So there was a havamina to say that you can only replace it if you removed it at a time or in a way where your intent is evident. L'mashal, if someone is going to remove now cholent Friday night, to have a little bit of cholent. Everyone knows that cholent is for Shabbos day. So it's evident that you want to put it back. Maybe only then indeed are you allowed to put it back. Masha'en kein, if you remove your cholent Shabbos 4 p.m. after the second Fabrengen, even though you really want to put it back on the fire for the other chevra that are coming after an hour. It's not evident. The observer says, okay, that's it. It's already, the Shabbos afternoon. One might have argued that it's not enough for you to have daitoy lahachzir. It has to be golui. So that's the chiddush of it doesn't have to be golui. It's not only if you remove Shabbos day food Friday night, can you return it Friday night, machzir and afilu b'Shabbos, even though you removed it at a time. Where most people, when they would remove it, then they would never put it back on the blech. As long as you're going to do what it says later, including here, you'll have kavana when you removed it to put it back, you can put it back. And va'af Rabbi Oishia savar af machzirin, even when you removed it on Shabbos, Rashi says, the loy muchacha, it's not evident, the shakalei adatel lahadurei.
Is that why the other Paschal we have to keep our hand on?
No, that's a separate thing. It's Samach, and we're going to have that in the Gemara soon. It's so good, We learned a little bit Shulchan Aruch, and we're going to see the source, and we're going to see there are 2 girsas in Chizki, I think, whether you have to have both in your hand and kavanos lahachzir, which is how we paskin, or one or the other. We're going back. We learned Shulchan Aruch a little bit, and now we're going to go back to the source. We were once standing in front of the great Rab Chia, and we brought up to him a kettle of hot fire that was on a blech. We removed it. Now, the blech and the hot fire was on the dioita tachtoin. It was on the lower story. He, the great Rab Chia, was on the elyoin. Here also, there's a link. That's the way the Rishonim learn. That when you take it out of the room, it's not evident that you plan to return it. Similar. Because when you remove something and then you right away return it, the fact that they went to the Diyot, that must be the link. So it wasn't Muchacha Milsa what the intent was, but we went upstairs. And we poured for him a hot cup of coffee, tea, whatever they had. And we put the koimkamois, we put the kettle back on the blech, on the fire, on Shabbos. No, it doesn't say this happened Shabbos day, but it doesn't say that it's not about Shabbos day, Friday night. It's about this nekuda that since it wasn't a different story, it was like lav muchacha milsa, and it's still okay. It's not about evident, it's about what you had in mind. If you had in mind to return it, you're good to go. Amar Abzreika, Amar Ababa, Amar Rebbe Tadoi. Loi Shanu, another precondition. Elosha Oidan Biyadai. Here we go. Oidan Biyadai, we spoke this out 2 days ago, doesn't mean that it's mamish in your hand. Like imagine, you have to be a gibber like Shimshon, where you pick up a cholent pot and you keep it in your hand, you only have 2 hands. One for Rashi, one for the Gemara here. It's one for the cholent handle and one for the cholent left. Like it means you can put it down on the stovetop, but the handle remains in your hand, or the edge of the pot remains in your hand. Now you know what that does? That's about the muchacha milsa. That makes it evident. That's not just about your kavana. So on one hand, circumstantial of what time Friday night Shabbos day, the same environment, a different environment. We don't need that. But we want you to keep it in your hand. If you put it down, it wasn't a stovetop, but it means it's no longer in your hand, then asur. Okay, why is it asur? This will be the words of the Rishonim. Chevra, a new placement on Shabbos is asur. We begin with that. Placing something anew on Shabbos, on the blech, is asur. And I know that this is a very broad statement, and then you have machlokes Sfardim and Ashkenazim when it comes to bishul achar bishul, but let's just begin the sugya by getting this approach. Chazara or ha-chazara means it's not a new placement. This was placed before Shabbos. Your removing it wasn't a full-fledged removal. So it's oidan biyadoi. It's not on the floor. So now it's called replacing and not new placing. Good. Amar Rab Ami, I want you to know that Rabbi Tadoi, the Avad Ligarmeyu, the Avad, he only speaks for himself. He only speaks for himself. We don't take that chumrah. We need for you to have kavana. That, yeah. But if you have kavana at Samach, this is, we don't pass, you can have kavana, you can let go of it. I don't care, you put it in your hand, you put it on the ground, doesn't matter. They were more lenient. That's a great source. Then mutter. Now the other requirements that we spoke in the intro, that's a given. No, it's the fact again that it has to be tafshil, that's mevushal called sarkoi. That the fire has to be gadol for katum. There is no shita anywhere that will allow for you. We learned the first half of the amid, the first amid, half of the daf today. What happens if you did shihiyah without a blech? Even in the scenarios where it's going to be okay, never to put it back. To make that clear. Even though the shihiyah was b'shoigig, shachach, doesn't matter. You know, you have to have it covered. Then again, the question is, there is going to be, according to a certain amount of heat that the food will still have to have, right? If the food became completely cold, then it's called a new placement. No, he's not, the only leniency is regarding the concept of still in your hand, oidan biyadoi. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yechanan, all you need is kavanah lahachzir. And now the Gemara says, actually, Pligi ba Rav Dimi and Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, and both of them in the name of Rabbi Elazar. There was a machlokes what he said. B'shmei Rabbi Elazar Amrei Kama Chad Amar. Listen to version number 1. Ba'oidan biyadoi mutar al gaba karka. V'chad Amar. I'm sorry. Slicha. Oidan biyadoi. I gotta make drink. Oidan biyadoi mutar al gaba karka asur. As we just quoted in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, Nami Muter. Now, Amar Chizkiya Mishmeid Abayim. And guys, this is going to be very important. There's going to be two versions of what Chizkiya said. Version number 1. Version number 1 is, we'll see clearly you need both. You need to have it in your hand and you have to have intent. That the Amrat, Oidan Biyadoi Mutar. Just because it's physically, your hand is still on the handle, you have to also have intent. Asur. Michlal, dal gabe karka, afagav shadaita lahachser also asur. It's not either or, you need both preconditions. That Chizkiya said either or. Amar Chizkiya mishmeid abaya, hoda amar gabe karka asur. That's only, karka means you let go of it, it's not in your hand. If you had in mind to put it back, you don't need it to have it in your hand. Michlal, it's taka either or, that if it is in your hand, even if you had no such intention, and we paskin al Rebbe paskins lechumra. It's not either or. Not only do you have to have kavana to put it back, you also have to keep some part of the pot in your hand as well. Now, Boye Rabbi Yirmiyah. This concept, my friends, now the way in the Gemara we had in your hand or you put it on the ground. Putting it on the ground is you completely removed yourself from it. What happens to lon b'makel? If it's hung on a makel, on a stick, it's hung on a peg, put on the countertop. Or hinichan agabi amit, it was put on a bed. You didn't remove yourself as much as putting it on the ground. Didn't answer. Boye Ravashi, I have another question. Huge. By water. You met all the conditions, guys. You oidan biyadoy and datil hachzor, and the chamin is chuchmanu kol tzarkon, and the blech is farblecht, and the water is still hot. but I took the water on kettle number 1. The kettle number 1 was placed Erev Shabbos on the blech. I took it off. I poured myself a cup. What happens if I take all of the water in kettle number 1 and pour it in kettle number 2? Everything is in my hand. Everything was b'kavanah to put, and I want to put it back on the blech. Does it bother me if the keli itself was not on the blech before Shabbos? That was the final inquiry. Pinon mi mecham lemecham ma'u. And on all of these inquiries, Zakimir, the Gemara says, Teiko tishbi yitaretz kushiyas vaboyas, or Teiko, the question still stands. L'chaim. Now we're moving on to the next mission. Here we go. So the Pedic is called Kira. Today's ovens are Kira, halachically. Stove tops are for sure Kira. The mile of Kira is that there's a lot of ventilation. So therefore, just for example, if it was fueled bikash u bigvava, being that to begin with, it's hard to cook things in a Kira relative to the tanur. When Shabbos comes in, there's nothing that remained from the straw. It's ash. No one is going to be a chata. In an environment that's super, super hot like a tanur, things can still cook in there, and maybe there's still this chashash. Tanur she'esiku, even only with straw or with stubble, says the Mishnah, lo yitein. This is before Shabbos. This is shehiyah. All right? Lo yitein bein mitoichoi bein al gabav. Let me add a very important word. Lo yitein, even if it's garuf and katum. Wow. Okay. Kupach is in between. It doesn't retain heat as much as the halachic tanur, because it's not narrower in the top. It's equally wide top and bottom, but because of it being smaller, there's only size for one pot on top. Smaller, the hotter. Smaller, hotter. It's mamish like we had on Ramadan, when stomach v'yafaloi. Bigger, you lose the heat. If the fuel is that straw in the stubble, then we equate halachically the kupach to the kirayim. But if we warm up the kupach with pulp or with wood that form into bona fide coals, then the kupach has a din of a tanur. Again, the way we're learning the Mishnah, that even by garuf and katum, you may not leave food inside of it or on top of it. Says the Gemara, Tanur sheisiku. We begin quoting the Mishnah. So Rabbi Yosef lemeimar toichoy mamish al gabav mamish. The topic of a Mishnah is only putting food either on top, which is what we call a stove top, or in it, like what we call an oven. Aval, if you remember, 2 days ago we were having this whole conversation, or yesterday even, putting something alongside of it. Aval lismoich, alongside of it. Shaper dummy. In other words, guys, the maskana that we had in the sugya above is that you are allowed to put food on the side of a kira, even though the kira was not garuf and katum. It's outside. It's not hot. Outside is outside. So they thought to say that even though it's a tanur, you are allowed to do it. And Abaye challenges. Ezvei Abaye says in the Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah, kupach sheisiku, depends. Bekasha begavava, it's like a kirayim. Kirayim means you are allowed to put it on top or inside, with all of the pratim. Right, with you have to have garuf and katum, but you can do it. There's an eitzah. Be careful, so eitzim, then it's categorically prohibited. It's like the tanur. Now, look at Abaye's inference. What's mashma? Ha kikira. If it would have been like a kira, then you would be allowed. But 1 second, how would you be allowed? How would you be allowed if we're speaking about something that's not garuf and katum? Ilem al gabav. That if it would have been like a kira, then you would be allowed, to put something on top, to leave it on top? How? How can you be allowed? That was the whole beginning of the Pedic. Ella kira ki eina gruf ketuma al gabav mishari. In other words, our Mishnah cannot be speaking about. What the Havamin is, that's important, that the Mishnah is speaking about an unblech. There's no blech. Because if there's a blech, then it's allowed. The chiddush is that if there's no blech, how is it allowed? It must be this Mishnah speaking about putting it on the side. The whole case of the Mishnah is putting it on the side. And in other words, what we are saying is that you cannot put it on the side of a tanur. Faket. That even on the side where Bekira you could, by the Tanur you can't. That goes against his teacher, Rav Yosef. Elo Lav, the Mishnah is speaking about, again, there must be the Havamid. The Mishnah is not speaking about Garuf and Katam. We're speaking about not Garuf and Katam. If it's not Garuf and Katam, then how can you even do it by Akira? So it must be speaking about putting it alongside of it. Yet it says, Hareu Ketanur, Kupach is like a Tanur, V'asr. The only thing that you are allowed to put alongside of it is by the Kira, not by the Tanur. So Omar Rav Ada Barahava, who said that the Mishnah is speaking about unblecht? For you to say it must be the Mishnah speaking about lismach. No, we're speaking about in a kupach that yes has a blech. It's garuf and katum. The tanur is garuf and ketuma. And nevertheless, if it was heated begefes or be'etzim, it's like a tanur, like we mentioned. The chumrah, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even a garuf and katum, you can't use a tanur at all. The alpha gav the garuf and katum, al gabav asur. And if it would have been like a kira, if the kupach would have been like a kira, even though you warmed it begefes or be'etzim, then by garuf and katam it would have been permitted. The Mishnah is not speaking about an unblecht. The Mishnah is speaking about a blecht. And that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. It's not about the kira. The chiddush of the Mishnah is concerning the tanur and sometimes the kupach. If it was heated up, begefes or be'etzim, that even though it's garuf and katam, you may not place food on top of the tanur.
So it sounds like it resolves that next to it is allowed. If we're talking about the more chomer din of putting it on top.
Could be. Kira, the Gemara said above, for sure you can put on the side. That means today you can put something near your blech. That's what we're talking about. No problem. Not only that, if you put it on top of a pot that's on top of the blech, it's also called on the side. In other words, you're putting it on a place that it cannot even reach Yatzei Ledes. That's not a problem. Very good. When it comes to a tanur, Machlekes Rabbi Yosef and Abaye. Okay, says the Gemara Vayt. Tanya Kavasi the Abaye. See, Abaye is more machmir here. Abaye is saying that by a tanur, we don't have a tanur today. But if you have a tanur, you may not place it on the long side of. I'm not saying we. I'm saying I don't have a tanur. So the normal oven that you have in your house, dinoi kikira, because since it gets open from the side, a lot of air goes into it and it cools it down. I want to say something else, I'm going to get to ovens, which is not the topic right now, is that the challenge with an oven is that when you open up the oven door, you are, according to most poskim, directly causing the fire to go up to keep that standard heat, unless you have a real Shabbos oven. And the poskim say it's much worse than the refrigerator, for example. When you open the fridge door, you are also causing eventually the motor to cool it off. I'm not the expert, but the experts say by a fridge it's more indirect, which is a huge key yisoid in Hilchas Shabbos, just like you have the same yisoid similarly when it comes to Hilchas Nezikin, direct or only indirect. So when you open up your door in New York and it's freezing and the heater is on, yes, you will at some point indirectly cause for the heater to go back on. You open up your fridge door and warm air comes in, you are indirectly causing for the motor to go back on. Masha Enkein, when you open up an oven, that's the way they paskin. It's much smaller, and it's made in a way that you open up a door, the fire is going to go up. That's another whole topic concerning our ovens, even though dinoi kikira as far as the heat is concerned. Okay, coming back over here. Tanya Kavas the Abaye again. We're speaking about can you put something alongside a tanur? Abaye was the machmer. Yeah, steht in Abraisa, the second white line. Tanur sheisiku bekashu begvava. If it was warmed, even with this like flimsy fuel, with straw and stubble, befedish. Hello, ein soim chinloi. Even bekashu, you can't put even something alongside of it. If ain't tzarech loimer, you can't put something al gabov. And if ain't tzarech loimer, you can't put something letoichai. If ain't tzarech loimer, if the tanur was fueled with gefes or eitzim, which have more choimer, that it's shaykh even more, shema yechata begachal. However, that's the high, that's the worst. Down one notch. Kupach, the smaller. There's only room for one pot. In other words, it's taka a square. It's not narrower in the top. It doesn't retain as much heat as a tanur, but it's still hotter than the kira. a kupach, shesiku bekashu begvava. If the fuel was taka the straw, then yes, soim chenloi. Listen to these words. But ve'ein noisnan al gabav. Begefesu be'etzim. Not only can you not put it on top, but then it becomes mamash like a tanur, meaning ve'ein soim chenloi. It can be feirush. Here clearly you see like Abaya. Explain to me this kupach. If a kupach is a kira, they wanted to have clarity in what it is, what's the metzias. Even though it had different names, so everyone knew it was something different. But if in principle, and the principle will be this, it's wide on top like in the bottom, and now it's a size issue. Why would it have a different name? I don't know. But if he thought it's something else, but halachically it should be like a kira, then afilu begefesu be'etzim. I mean, guys, that was the beginning of the Spedic. What did we learn in the beginning of the Spedic? What are we paskin right now? That as long as it's garu for katum, we paskin like Basil. Right? If you cover the fire, then and like Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rav Meir and over there in the beginning, Daf Lamed Zayin. Then nami, then you should be allowed. You should be allowed by garu for katum. Like a kira. And ikatanur dami, then afilu bekashu begvava, nami, not even to put it on the side. So that's the point. So he told him, yeah, what, you want to know what a kupach is? Nafish havle midikira. It retains heat more than the kira, simply because it's smaller. Look at the klal. The bigger, in other words, it was a rectangular dekira. Meaning there's room to put on its rim 2 pots. So therefore, the more air went into the top. Didn't stay that hot. This is simply smaller. And v'zutar havle, but it has less heat than the tanur. Heiki damich kupach and heiki damich kira. More details to clarify this. So Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, like this. Kupach, mokoim, shefisas, kedeira, achas. Where can you place a pot? I want to make it clear, guys. It's not just a stovetop. Before Kevin put a good picture up over there, it was a keli that you could put food on top, on the rim, and inside of it there was also a door in its wall, which is why we say that our ovens dinoi kikira. So, but there's only room for 1 pot. It's very little. Kira makaim shvisas shtei kedeiros. There's room to place 2 kedeiros. Amar Abaye v'temer Rabbi Yirmiyah afan anametanina. We're going to quote a Mishnah in Kalim from where it will become clear the physical difference between a kira and a tanur. Ubehegdim, the klal is that if you have a keli that became tamei, obviously if it's made of a material that allows it to be taken to the mikvah, certain kelim like klei cheres are unmikvable. You can't take it to the mikvah. Other kelim, even though you can take it to the mikvah, but there is a rule across the board that if that keli halachically breaks, the tumah goes away. Then there's whole questions. What happens if you break it and you put it back together? Does the tumah return? If it breaks, the tumah goes away. So says the Mishnah like this. Now what does the definition of breaking mean? Be'ikir. That something happened to it that the function for which it was made, it no longer serves. So says in the Mishnah, Kira, if shenechel kol ha'orka tahira, if it broke on its length. Now if you can just imagine, Kevin is not here today, if you can just imagine this rectangular kira, if it broke in its width, now you have 2 kupachs. And even though you can't put anything inside of it because there's no wall retaining the heat for the inside, but as far as a stovetop is concerned, it's perfectly functional. That's a raya that the only difference between the kira and the kupach is how long is it. That's why we say that a kira is rectangular. It's not a bigger box. It's the same width, which means that it was made in the standard width that when you put a keli on top of it, the keli doesn't fall through it. It's open, which is how the heat is going under the pot, but the walls of the kira is going to be under the width of the bottom of the pot. Kira means that there's place for 2. So if it broke lengthwise, Now you can't use it at all. So when it comes to the dinim of tum and tara, even though it was tameh before, now it's tahira because it no longer can function for its original purpose. If it broke l'rachba, it remains tameh. You know why? Because a kira is like a double kupach, in only in one side. It's rectangular. So if it broke l'rachba, now ki'ilu you have two kupachs, but it still functions as a stovetop. But a kupach, to begin with, it only has the size for one pot. So no matter which direction it breaks, bein la'orka, bein la'rachba, it no longer can function, and therefore it becomes tahor. Cheva, we'll stop over here. God willing, to be continued.